So as you can see, there is a lot of evidence for this biopsychological view of near-death experiences. But I know some of you are going to be asking yourselves, haven't I heard of near-death experiences where people have come back with what seems like verifiable evidence that they, for example, maybe made observations of the operating room or something else about the hospital staff that they shouldn't have been able to know otherwise? The idea that there are a lot of verifiable or accurate near-death experiences is actually a bit of a misnomer. There were a few cases that seemed like convincing near-death experiences at the time, but the vast majority have been outright debunked. One of the most cited cases is the case of Maria. Maria was a migrant worker who in the 1980s visited a hospital and had 2 heart attacks during her 3-day stay. During her second heart attack, she reported afterward that she had floated out of her body and then while floating outside of the hospital had spotted a dark blue shoe on the 3rd-story ledge of the hospital. She reported this to the nurse Kimberly Clark, who became curious about it, and at the behest of Maria went out to find this blue shoe. When she went out of the hospital and looked up from the hospital grounds, she couldn't see anything. As she visited the 3rd story of the hospital and looked out the windows, again, she couldn't see anything. But as she went from room to room, looking at each window, she did find that as she pressed her face against the glass of one 3rd-story window, she found a dark blue shoe exactly as Maria had described it. This was seen as a very convincing case of near-death experience because there's no way Maria could have seen the shoe coming into the hospital as she was wheeled in on a gurney in the hospital entrance. There's also no way Maria could have seen the shoe from inside the hospital because she was kept in beds the entire time and couldn't have gotten that close to any 3rd-story window. Years later, Kimberly Clark reported this incident to psychologist Kenneth Ring, who works out at the University of Connecticut. He was at the time gathering NDE accounts, and this one fascinated him. It seemed like a verifiable evidence of near-death experience. So when Kenneth Ring published this in a collection of near-death experiences, the media really tagged onto this one because it seemed the most convincing. And it became the topic of many media outlets, news networks, talk shows. It even inspired a couple of movies, for example, Ghost and Ghost Dad in 1990. But the story of Maria and her found shoe turned out to not be all that accurate. In 1994, a couple of undergraduate students from a local university went to perform a little experiment at the Harborview Medical Center where this story took place. They got a shoe that fit the description of Kimberly Clark's story and placed it on the exact ledge in the exact position she said she found it. Then they went outside of the hospital and found that actually they could easily see the shoe from the hospital grounds, including the entrance where Maria had been wheeled into the hospital. They also found that when they were inside the hospital in that room, where Maria had likely stayed during bed rest between her 2 heart attacks, they could easily see the shoe even from bedside levels up to 15 feet away. So it's very likely that Maria could have seen the shoe either entering the hospital or during her 3-day stay between heart attacks. It's also likely that Maria could have overheard other people talking about the shoe on the ledge during her stay. To prove the point, the 2 undergraduates left the shoe where it was and found just a couple of days later that someone had removed it. Clearly, people could easily see the shoe. They took photographs of the shoe in its position from many different angles and published their findings in Skeptical Inquirer, and other researchers have since verified their account. Even more troubling, it could have been that Kimberly Clark just made the whole story up. In fact, by the time the press got wind of it and they asked her to show the shoe, she had conveniently lost it. Now, if something that amazing had happened to me, I think I would have put that shoe in a pretty safe place. Also, nobody's been able to locate Maria, so the only account we have of this story is secondhand by the nurse Kimberly Clark who was working at the hospital at the time. And in fact, many people have tried to find Maria, posting ads around offering rewards for anyone who knows anything about her, and yet no Maria has ever popped up. Kimberly Clark, now Kimberly Clark Sharp, has come out with many books about her account and made millions of dollars on book sales and tours of Christian and after-death conferences. So in this way, it could have been that she made up the story and then cashed in on it. And plus, over the years, her story has grown that many other people had similar verifiable near-death accounts, and that even she herself has had near-death experiences. Usually when we see a story growing like that over the years, it hints that there's no solid basis to it. And yet, still to this day, when people talk about verifiable near-death experiences, the story Maria is usually the first one to come up. It was widely covered in the media and is still talked about as a verifiable case of near-death experience, even though it's been largely discredited. Over the years, there have been some other cases that have seemed convincing, but whenever researchers have looked into them, they've turned out to be easily debunked. Now, when honest researchers go out and collect near-death stories in an unbiased way, they actually find that the vast majority contain clear inaccuracies and hallucinations. Oftentimes, people misremember the operating room procedures or who was in the operating room at the time, what the operating room looked like, what people were saying, what family members were there. Usually there's some evidence that what's really going on as people are floating outside of their body and observing the environment around them is that they're creating this through a hallucination that's not really tied to the real world. In fact, when Alvarado, a researcher in 2000, collected over 300 such accounts and went through them to verify them through hospital records, he was able to easily disprove all but about 60 of them. And then when he further investigated those 60, he found that all but 3 contained inaccuracies, such as details about the operating room and procedure that just weren't true. In fact, the 3 that remained couldn't be discredited simply because they were too vague. There were no specific details that could be verified one way or the other. So in this way, when Alvarado looked at 300 cases, he could easily discredit all but 3 of them. That's a 99% falsification rate. Several hospitals around the country and around the world have even tried to set up the perfect circumstances in which to prove a near-death out-of-body experience. In these hospitals, in the operating rooms or places where people commonly have near-death experiences, they place posters that are above eye level and facing upward toward the ceiling. That way people could only see what's on them if they were actually floating above the room. And on these posters, they put brightly colored images, words that should be very conspicuous and grab the viewer's attention if anyone is actually floating outside of their body. And what they found after about 20 years of these types of experiments is that not one person who's had a near-death experience has reported one of these posters as part of their out-of-body viewing experience. So if there is someone out there who's had a verifiable near-death experience, scientists just haven't found them yet.